I am 106 years old, and I want to tell you something that nobody, not my husband, not my financial advisor, not a single person I trusted with my future, ever sat me down and said out loud. I had enough money to retire comfortably. I did everything they told me to do. I saved. I was disciplined. I went without things I wanted so that one day I could rest without worry. And then, slowly, quietly, like a fire you don't smell until the walls are already burning, inflation took $180,000 away from me, not in one dramatic moment, not in a stock market crash I could point to and grieve. It happened in grocery stores, in pharmacy lines, in utility bills that kept arriving with bigger and bigger numbers. It happened in the spaces between the life I planned and the life I actually lived. And if you are sitting wherever you are right now, thinking that you are too young for this conversation, or that your savings plan is solid, or that this story is about someone else, I am asking you, with everything I have left, to please keep watching. Because I am living proof that the most dangerous financial mistake is the one that looks like patience. If this channel has ever helped you think differently about money and your future, please take a second right now and hit that subscribe button, because the conversations we have here, honest ones, uncomfortable ones, the kind your family might never start at the dinner table, these are the conversations that can change the entire shape of a life. I wish someone had shown me a channel like this when I was your age. I am not exaggerating when I say it might have saved me from decades of quiet financial pain. Subscribe, and let's keep talking. Now let me take you back to the beginning of my story. I was born in 1919. I came into this world in the aftermath of one war and grew up in the shadow of another. My parents were not wealthy people. My father worked at a mill. My mother stretched every dollar with a kind of genius that I have never seen replicated in any personal finance book. She could make a Sunday chicken last through Wednesday. She darned socks until the darns themselves needed darning. I watched her, and I absorbed the most foundational financial lesson of my childhood, that the way you survive is by holding on tight to what you have. That belief followed me into adulthood like a loyal but slightly misguided companion. When I married Harold in 1947, we were both 28 years old and burning with the particular optimism of people who had survived hard times and believed the hard times were finally behind them. Harold worked as an engineer for a manufacturing company in Ohio. I worked as a bookkeeper for a local insurance firm until our first child was born, and then I stayed home and kept our household accounts with the same precision I had applied to the office ledgers. We were savers, serious, committed, almost religious savers. Every week, a portion of Harold's paycheck went directly into a savings account at our local bank. We did not buy things on credit if we could help it. We drove cars until they refused to run. We took vacations by driving to state parks and sleeping in a tent we had owned since our honeymoon. We were not suffering. We were building. And by 1972, when Harold retired at the age of 53 due to a heart condition his doctors said required him to step away from the pressures of full-time work, we had what felt like an extraordinary sum set aside. We had approximately $310,000 saved between our bank accounts, a modest pension Harold had earned over 25 years, and a small inheritance I had received when my mother passed in 1968. In 1972, $310,000 was real money. Our house was paid off. Our children were grown. Harold's pension covered the basic bills. We thought we had built a fortress around our future. We thought we had done everything right. And for the first few years, we had. The early 1970s were comfortable. We ate well. We helped our grandchildren with their school expenses. We took one real vacation, a trip to see the Grand Canyon that Harold had been talking about for 30 years. We were not extravagant, but we were free. And freedom, when you have worked your whole life for it, tastes like nothing else in the world. But then something started happening that I did not have a name for at the time. I remember standing in our grocery store in 1974 and noticing that the cart I pushed out of that store every week was lighter than it used to be, even though I was spending more. The same amount of money that had filled our refrigerator completely 2 years earlier was now leaving gaps on the shelves. I mentioned it to Harold. He said prices were going up a little, but that it would settle down. He had lived through the Depression. He had a deep instinctive belief that things always settled down. They did not settle down, not for a very long time. What Harold and I were experiencing in that grocery store, what we were experiencing in the gas station, at the doctor's office, in every ordinary transaction of our ordinary retired lives, was inflation running at rates that would have been unthinkable to the people who had advised us on our retirement savings. Between 1973 and 1981, inflation in the United States averaged over 8% per year. In 1979 alone, it hit more than 11%. That means that every single year, the purchasing power of the money sitting in our savings account was shrinking significantly. Not metaphorically, not as some abstract economic concept, literally, actually. The dollars we had set aside so carefully were becoming worth less and less with each passing month. And here is the thing that I need you to understand before we go any further. Our savings account was not keeping up. The interest we were earning on our money did not come close to matching the rate at which inflation was devouring its value. We were watching our financial fortress erode from the inside, and we did not fully understand what was happening until a significant portion of the damage was already done. By my careful calculations years later, between 1972 and 1982 alone, inflation had effectively stolen the equivalent of more than $60,000 of purchasing power from our savings. And we had not spent it. We had not wasted it. It had simply ceased to exist as real, usable wealth. Harold passed away in 1983. He was 64 years old. He never fully understood what inflation had done to our plans, because by the time the 1980s arrived and people were openly talking about the inflation crisis, Harold's mind was occupied with his health and with the grandchildren he adored, and with the small daily pleasures of a life well lived. I am grateful he was spared the full weight of knowing. But I was not spared. When Harold died, I became the sole manager of what remained of our savings, and for the first time in my married life, I sat down and tried to understand not just how much we had, but what it was actually worth, what I could actually do with it, and what I would need to survive. I was 64 years old, in reasonable health, with no idea that I would eventually live to be 106. Nobody told me to plan for 40 more years of expenses. Nobody told me that a woman of my general health profile might routinely outlive the financial plan she and her husband had carefully constructed in their 40s. My financial advisor, a kind man named Robert, who wore the same brown suit every time I met with him, told me that my savings, combined with the Social Security benefit I would start collecting, should be more than enough to see me comfortably through my remaining years. He used phrases like remaining years as if they were a knowable, manageable quantity, as if a life could be neatly projected on a spreadsheet. I want to tell you now plainly that the single most financially damaging assumption Harold and I ever made was that we would need our money to last for maybe 20 years after retirement. That assumption, so reasonable, so statistically sensible for people of our generation, was wrong. And it was wrong not because we were foolish, but because nobody gave us the tools to question it. The years after Harold died were years of gradual, grinding adjustment. I was careful. I cut my spending in ways that would have made my mother proud. I stopped helping with the grandchildren's expenses. I sold the car and relied on my daughter for transportation. I turned the thermostat down in winter until my fingers were stiff in the mornings. None of these sacrifices were dramatic. None of them felt like a crisis in the moment. But they accumulated year after year into a life that was substantially smaller than the life Harold and I had worked so hard to build. By the time I reached my 80s, the $310,000 we had begun retirement with had been reduced through decades of living expenses, through the relentless pressure of inflation, through healthcare costs that my 1972 self could not have imagined, to something that required constant management and constant anxiety. I had approximately $130,000 left, and I was 80 years old with no clear end point in sight. My daughter Patricia, who has managed my affairs since I turned 90, once sat down with me and tried to calculate, as honestly as she could, how much inflation had truly cost me over the course of my retirement. She is an accountant. She has a precise mind and a gentle way of delivering difficult truths. She told me that if I had invested even a meaningful portion of our retirement savings in assets that kept pace with or outpaced inflation, if I had put money into the stock market, into real estate, into Treasury inflation-protected securities, into anything that moved with the economy rather than sitting static in a savings account, the numbers would look radically different. She estimated conservatively that the combination of inflation's direct erosion and the lost investment growth it represented had cost me somewhere between $160,000 and $200,000 over the course of my retirement. She split the difference and called it $180,000. That number has lived in my chest ever since like a stone I cannot put down. I want to be clear about something important. I am not telling you this story so that you will feel sorry for me. I have had a life of remarkable length, and for most of it, genuine richness. I loved Harold. I love my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren I have been privileged enough to meet. I have seen a century of history that most people only read about in books. I am not a sad woman, but I am an honest one, and the honest truth is that the financial mistakes I made, or rather, the financial education I never received, caused me real hardship in the years when I was least equipped to manage it, and I do not want that for you. So what do I wish I had known? What would I tell my 28-year-old self standing in that Ohio apartment with Harold, full of discipline and good intentions and the kind of confidence that comes from having survived the worst already? I would tell her that saving money is not the same as protecting money, that discipline and sacrifice mean nothing if the vehicle you choose for your savings cannot keep pace with the world's tendency to become more expensive. I sat in a savings account for decades feeling virtuous while inflation quietly picked my pocket. $1 in a savings account earning 2% interest in a year when inflation is running at 8% is not $1 growing. It is $1 dying slowly. I did not understand this. I do now. I would tell her that longevity is not a gift you can afford to ignore when planning your finances. When Harold and I built our retirement plan, we were thinking in 20-year terms. But women in my family have always had a stubborn relationship with death. My grandmother lived to 91. My mother lived to 87. I am 106. If I had known, truly internalized, that I might live for 40 or even 45 years after my husband retired, I would have approached every savings and investment decision completely differently. I would have been less focused on preserving capital and more focused on growing it in ways that could sustain me through a timeline that would have seemed impossible to plan for, but was in fact my actual life. I would tell her to find a financial advisor who talks about inflation the way a doctor talks about a chronic disease, not as a distant possibility to be mentioned briefly and moved past, but as a persistent, manageable, ever-present reality that requires an active, ongoing strategy. Robert in the brown suit was a good man, but he never once sat across from me and said, "Dorothy, if inflation averages even 4% over the next 30 years, here is exactly what that will do to the real value of your savings." That conversation never happened, and I needed it to happen. I would tell her that healthcare costs in retirement are not a line item. They are a force of nature. In 1972, a doctor's visit cost a few dollars. A hospital stay, while serious, was not the kind of financial event that could wipe out years of savings in a matter of months. I have watched healthcare inflation outpace general inflation so dramatically over the course of my life that I sometimes feel as though the medical world and the financial world were operating in entirely different universes. Every retirement plan needs a healthcare cushion that is far larger than feels reasonable in the moment you build it. I did not have that cushion, and I paid for its absence many times over. I would tell her not to be afraid of the stock market simply because it rises and falls. I grew up in the Depression. I watched adults around me lose things in ways that left permanent scars on how they thought about financial risk. That fear was reasonable given the context, but carried forward without examination, it became its own kind of risk. The risk of holding too still while the world moved around me. The risk of choosing the comfort of certainty over the possibility of growth. Every study I have ever heard described to me by my grandchildren suggests that over the very long term, and I am, as you may have gathered, an expert in the very long term, diversified investment in the stock market has historically outpaced inflation more reliably than almost any other option available to ordinary people. I did not invest in the stock market until I was in my 70s, and by then the window for the kind of growth that could have genuinely protected my retirement had significantly narrowed. And finally, I would tell her, I would tell you, that the conversation about money is never finished. Harold and I built our plan, and then largely considered it built. We revisited it in moments of crisis or change, but not as a regular practice. We did not sit down every few years and ask whether the assumptions we had made still held, whether the strategy we had chosen was still serving us, whether the world had changed in ways that required us to change with it. Financial plans are not structures you build and walk away from. They are gardens. They need tending. The ones you neglect do not simply stay the same. They decay. I'm 106 years old, and I've been telling this story for years now to anyone who will listen, because I believe with every remaining part of me that the education I lacked is available to you. You are living in an era of information that would have seemed like science fiction to the young woman I was. You have access to knowledge, to tools, to conversations like this one that could save you from the specific, slow, invisible devastation that inflation wrought on my retirement and the retirements of so many people in my generation. Please do not waste that access. Please do not assume that because you are saving, you are protected. Please do not assume that because your plan feels solid today, it will remain solid through decades of a world you cannot fully predict. Please ask harder questions than I did. Push back on the answers that feel too comfortable. Make your financial advisor say the word inflation and then make them explain in specific terms what their strategy does about it. I cannot get my $180,000 back. That money lived in the gap between what I assumed and what was actually true, and it is gone now in the way that lost time is gone, completely, irreversibly, without appeal. But you have not lost yours yet. You are sitting here, reading or watching or listening, and the gap between where you are and where you want to be is still closable. The mistakes I made are still avoidable for you. That is the only reason a 106-year-old woman has any business still raising her voice, not to mourn what she lost, but to make sure that you don't lose it too. If this story reached something in you, if some part of what I have said today is going to change how you think about your retirement plan, or prompt a conversation you have been putting off, or send you back to look at assumptions you made years ago and have not revisited since, then please share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do it now, because we are just getting started, and the next conversation may be the one that changes everything for you. I will be here as long as I am able, and I intend to be useful every single minute of it.